here's a pop quiz. What did Jacob give Joseph that sparked his brother's murderous jealousy? If you said a coat of many colors, you're in good company. I mean, they even made a Broadway musical about it, right? But that is what Sunday school flannel boards show. This is what children's Bible depicts, right? And yes, what the Broadway musical immortalized. But there is one problem. The Hebrew text of Genesis 37:3 does not actually say many colors. The phrase translated for centuries as a coat of many color words is two Hebrew words, ketonet, passim. And scholars, yeah, they debate for a very long time about what that actually means. Does it mean long sleeves, ornamental designs, striped patterns, specific type of priestly garment? I mean, in the answer honestly, it's we're not entirely sure. But here's where something can get fascinating about this, right? And this is where Latter-day Saints should pay especially close attention. So what if this garment was not just an expensive coat that Jacob gave to his favorite son? What if it has some deeper significance, some covenantal significance, some, dare I say, priestly significance, or even temple-related significance? What if Joseph's mysterious ketonet passim connects directly to the garments that God gave Adam and Eve back in Genesis 3:21? And what if it's connected to the same type of garment later worn by Aaron and the high priests? All right. And what if now we are moving into more speculative but theological rich territory? What if this garment was literally composed of the remnants of the very garments God used to clothe Adam and Eve when they left Eden? Food for thought. Hello, everyone. I'm Ricky Black, aka Elder Eleazar, and this is Come Listen with Me. And today we're doing a bonus deep dive on the garment that was not many colors. Right? We're gonna explore the Hebrew linguistics, ancient Jewish tradition, and the Latter-day Saint temple theology to better understand what Joseph actually received from his father and why it mattered so much. And this is going to challenge you and what you think you do know. And it is going to be scholarly. We're going to make sure we have lots of sources to cite. And for the LDS viewers, it is going to connect to some of the most sacred symbols of covenant in our theology. So let us go ahead and begin to dig in. All right. So let me be very clear, as we always do in these videos, about what we are going to do in this video. Part of this video is to establish biblical scholarship. That means Hebrew linguistics, ancient Near East context, and comparative textual analysis. It's just a foundation. And part of this video is plausible theologic interpretation that's built on that foundation. So that means we're going to be connecting some dots between Genesis 3 and Genesis 37 and Exodus 28 and the broader biblical theme of sacred garments. And part of this video, especially towards the end, we're going to move into, well, a more speculative tradition, or as I like to call it, gospel according to Ricky, right? It's just kind of my speculation on these sorts of things. Hopefully an informed speculation, but in speculation nonetheless. And that includes ancient Jewish sources and Latter-day Saint theological reflection that are going to be included. And I'll be clear when we move from the scholarship into the speculation period. All right. Now, but even with the speculative material, it is worth considering because it opens up theological vistas that are really generally illuminating. And I find that they're just breathtaking and eye-opening to a lot of faith in what we see in the scriptures. So here's our roadmap. First, we're going to tackle the Hebrew itself. What does ketonet passim actually mean, and why has the translation been so contested? Second, we're going to trace the theme of sacred garments through Genesis from Eden to Egypt and show that the clothing in the patriarchal narratives is never merely just functional clothing. And third, we're going to explain how this connects to LDS temple theology and the sacred garment traditions. And fourth, we will examine the speculative but fascinating theory that Joseph's garment may have contained remnants from Adam's original ketonet in Genesis 3:21. And finally, what the brothers destroyed when they dipped the garment in blood and what they could not destroy. All right, so let's start with the Hebrew. Genesis 37:3 says that Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, and he made him a ketonet passim. The word ketonet, it's actually fairly straightforward. It means a tunic or a robe, a long garment that's worn next to the skin. And it appears all over the Old Testament for ordinary clothing, for priestly garments in Exodus 28, and for garments that signify rank and status. That part is not especially difficult. The real puzzle is passim. See, the word appears only twice in the entire Old Testament. Once here in Genesis 37 and once in 2 Samuel 13, where it describes the garment worn by Tamar, the daughter of King David. That's it. Only those two occurrences. So our evidence is limited. And now, one major reason coat of many colors become so famous is because of the Septuagint. That's the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. The Septuagint translated passim with a word suggesting something many-colored or variegated. Now, the Greek reading became enormously influential. Jerome followed it in the Latin Vulgate, and the King James translators inherited that same tradition. And once coat of many colors entered the English-speaking imagination, it became almost impossible to dislodge it, right? But modern scholarship has raised serious doubts about that translation, and there are many, many alternatives. One proposal is that passim refers to the extremities, like the palms or the soles of the feet. And if so, these phrases may describe a long robe that reaches to the wrist and the ankles. And that would matter culturally, right? Because in the ancient Near East, working men wore shorter garments for freedom of movement. A long robe with full sleeves, that signaled high status and station. It marked someone as not engaged in ordinary manual labor. So if Jacob gave Joseph that kind of garment, he was making a statement, right? He's saying, in effect, you are not positioned like your brothers. You are, in fact, set apart. A second proposal is that the term refers to ornamentation, embroidery, or decorative work of some kind of distinguished event. So the embroidery may stick out to the LDS viewers for particular reasons. And that would fit the Tamar parallel in 2 Samuel 13. See, Tamar's ketonet passim is not just clothing. It is clothing associated with royal daughters. It marks status, purity, and distinction, a sort of separation. A third possibility is that the garment was striped or patterned, not necessarily multicolored in like a rainbow sense, but woven or decorated in a way that made it distinctive. And then there's the theologically interesting possibility. Could ketonet passim refer not merely to an expensive garment, but a special type of ritual, priestly, or covenantal garment? That question matters because ketonet is also the word used for priestly clothing in Exodus 28. So this may not be just a favored son's special outfit, right? It may carry theological and symbolic weight that we need to be paying attention to. And the Tamar parallel pushes us in that direction, right? Her garment is associated with royal status, purity, and it's a distinction. It separates her from others. It marks her publicly as belonging to a special category. She has been set apart. So if we bring that back to Joseph, his ketonet passim is not just a nice coat. It was a garment that marked him, and it declared him as being set apart. In his case, though, also chosen. He is positioned differently within the family. And if that is the case, it helps explain why the brothers jealously burned so hot. They didn't just see favoritism, they saw inheritance, and they saw covenant priority, and they saw status that in their minds should not have belonged to Joseph. So no wonder they hated him, right? Now, to understand the deeper significance of Joseph's garment, we have to trace a theme of sacred clothing through Genesis. Because garments in Scripture are rarely just garments. I mean, Scriptures don't start talking about clothing just for the sake of it. It's not wasting space. It's always carrying something important, right? Garments in the Old Testament, they carry some sort of identity and authority and are often tied to covenant meanings. The first mention of clothing in all of Scripture comes in Genesis 3:21. After the fall, the Lord makes coats of skins from Adam and Eve, and he clothes them. And the Hebrew word there is ketonet. It's the same word used for Joseph's garment. That alone should make you pause and think for just a second, right? Because in Genesis 3, Adam and Eve first try to cover themselves with fig leaves. That's human effort, and it's completely inadequate for covering. So then God places the self-made covering with garments that he himself provides. And those garments, they actually require a sacrifice. See, animal skin means that something died. So from the very beginning, clothing in Scripture is linked to divine provision, covering, and post-fall covenant life. Now, ancient Jewish interpreters, they noticed this. They absolutely took note of it, right? Some rabbinic traditions speak of Adam and Eve's garments as garments of glory. And that language may be in interpretive tradition and not just, a biblical statement. But it shows that early readers did not treat these garments as just practical. They saw them as theologically charged with great significance and meaning. And it becomes even more interesting when we move to Exodus. You see, in Exodus 28, God gives detailed instructions for priestly garments. And again, one of the core terms is ketonet, the priestly tunic. The garments are described as being for glory and for beauty. And they're not optional accessories either. They mark those authorized to approach God. And they signify priestly office, sacred responsibility, and authorized access to holy spaces. So it's a pretty clear pattern, right? Sacred garments mark covenant relationship, priestly role, and access to God. So now look again at the patriarchal narratives. In Genesis 27, Jacob wears Esau's garments in order to receive the birthright blessing. Again, clothing is tied to the transfer of covenant inheritance. And in Genesis 37, Joseph receives the ketonet passim from Jacob. Again, clothing marking identity, inheritance, and favored status. In Genesis 39, Joseph leaves his garment behind when fleeing Potiphar's wife. Once again, clothing becomes evidence inside a story of deception. And in Genesis 41, Pharaoh clothes Joseph in fine linen and places a gold chain around his neck, marking his elevation and authority. So all through Genesis, garments are never just background details. They're important markers of identity, they mediate status, and they signify blessing, deception, transition, and authority. And the repeated use of the word ketonet helps link these scenes together, right? Adam's garment from God, Joseph's garment from Jacob, and the priestly garments of Exodus. So the text is inviting us to see patterns. And if we learned anything when we're studying the scriptures, is that the scriptures are all about patterns. So a theological thread running from Eden through the patriarchs into Israel's priestly life. And for Latter-day Saints, the theology of sacred garments takes on particular added significance because of temple worship. And while I want to handle this carefully and with reverence, in Latter-day Saint theology, the garment of the holy priesthood is a sacred symbol of our covenant relationship with God. For endowed members, it is not ordinary clothing. It is a reminder of sacred commitments, sacred identity, and covenant belonging. And that means passages like Genesis 3:21, they naturally matter to LDS readers. So Exodus 28 and the biblical theme of priestly clothing more broadly, well, yeah, LDS theology has often understood that the garments given to Adam and Eve are more than mere survival clothing. They are seen as connected to the priesthood, to covenant, and to divine coverings. And if that is true, then an obvious question arises. If the patriarchs held priesthood authority and lived in covenant relationship with God, did they also possess sacred garments as a sign of that covenant relationship? Now, LDS tradition has often answered that question, yes. Not necessarily in a simplistic one-to-one historical way, but in the sense that sacred clothing belongs to the pattern of priesthood and covenant from the very beginning, from the garden, from Genesis, right? Interestingly, though, ancient Jewish tradition sometimes points in the same direction. So some rabbinic texts, they preserve the idea that Adam's garments were passed down through the covenant line. That's actually really cool. It's a lot of fun if you think about it. Now, that can't be proven historically, obviously, but it is fascinating that both Jewish tradition and LDS thought see Genesis 3:21 as having ongoing covenant significance. Both traditions in their own way, like we see these garments as more than just ancient outer wear, right? They're linked to the priesthood, sacred inheritance, and covenant continuity. And that's important for Joseph, because if Jacob gave Joseph a garment connected to patriarchal priesthood or covenant transmission, then the brothers were not simply angry without affection, right? Like they were angry about a symbolic inheritance that went beyond any sort of property, right? It was about sacred priority and who would carry the covenant line forward. Now, I do want to be very clear. I'm not saying we can prove Joseph's garment was literally a temple garment in the LDS sense. That would go beyond what the evidence can support or what I would ever expect it to be able to support. What I am saying, though, is that the scriptural pattern of sacred garments marking covenant relationship, it runs consistently from Eden through the patriarchs into priestly Israel and resonates deeply with LDS temple theology. And the theology is coherent even where the history cannot be mapped out with perfect certainty. All right, so now we're going to move into that more speculative territory. And I want to be explicit about that. That's what we're doing, right? What follows is not established biblical scholarship. It's a combination of ancient tradition and theological reflection, right? This is the part where I'm not alone in this, but we'll just call it gospel according to Ricky right here. But it is fascinating, and I think it's worth pondering. The theory is this: what if Joseph's ketonet passim was not merely symbolic of Adam's garment, but was literally composed of the remnants of the original garments God gave to Adam and Eve? See, this idea shows up in later Jewish traditions. Like some rabbinic sources, they actually preserve a lineage of transmission. Adam, then Enoch, then Methuselah, then Noah, then Abraham, then Isaac, then Jacob, and finally Joseph. Now, again, I can't prove that historically. The biblical text itself does not narrate that chain, but the tradition does exist. And once it exists, it raises those natural questions. If the garments were passed down, why would Joseph receive not the original whole garment, but something distinctive called ketonet passim? So one answer could be deterioration. If an ancient sacred garment had been preserved through generations, it may have been a bit worn, patched, reworked, and only partially incorporated into something new over time. And another possibility is symbolic incorporation. Jacob may have had a new garment made for Joseph, but included within it were remnants of an older ancestral garment. And if passim has anything to do with pieces, sections, or special extensions, then suddenly the term becomes very, very intriguing, right? A garment of pieces, which is what a ketonet passim could be, right? A garment assembled and carrying old sacred material inside a new form. Now, again, that can't be proven, but think about the theological force of it, right? If Joseph's garment carried remnants of Adam's original ketonet, then Joseph would be wearing the tangible link to humanity's first covenant crisis, the moment when God clothed fallen humanity by divine grace. And that would symbolize a continuity of priesthood, of covenant, and of all sacred inheritances. It could also deepen Joseph's typological significance, right? What we're seeing from him. Joseph becomes a type of Christ, the suffering innocent one who preserves life. And if he does so while clothed in the line of Adam's garment, then that symbolism is only greater, right? It's intensified. The first man, the fall, death entering into the world. Yeah. And then Joseph, through suffering, preserving many to live. The resonances, they're really rich, right? And I love those connections and what it could mean. Now, for Latter-day Saints, it also creates really powerful theological arc, right? From Adam's sacred covering through patriarchal transmission and through priesthood lineage to later temple symbolism and restoration. Yeah, it's very fun to think about. Now, again, just being honest here, the biblical text never explicitly says any of this. The rabbinic traditions are later than when Genesis is written down. And the meaning of passim, it remains uncertain. It's not 100% clear. And there is no archaeological evidence for anything like this specifically, nor would we realistically expect there to be any. I would not expect to find anything for that. So I can't present this as an established fact, but I can say this. It is theologically rich and it fits a larger pattern that already is present in the texts, and it helps explain why Joseph's garment may have mattered so much more than modern readers often assume. Can't prove it, but I do think it's worth pondering and thinking about. Now, whether or not Joseph's ketonet passim contained literal remnants of Adam's garment, their narrative makes one thing very clear. The brothers understood that the garment mattered, that it was important. And when they stripped Joseph and threw him into the pit, they were not just removing clothing. They were stripping him of his visible identity, inheritance, status, and a visible covenant position. And then they dipped the garment in blood. That scene, totally loaded with symbolism. An animal dies, its blood covers the garment, and the garment becomes evidence of supposed death. It's a really strong inversion. In Genesis 3, an animal's death is tied to divine covering, and here an animal's blood is used in human deception. What once marked favor now appears to testify that the favored one is gone. And Jacob sees the bloody garment and believes that Joseph is dead. So the garment signified covenant life becomes for a moment a false witness to death. But it is a lie because Joseph still lived, and that was important because the garment is violated but not ultimate. So the brothers can strip Joseph of the symbol, but they cannot strip him of what the symbol represented. And that becomes clear in Genesis 39, where the repeated phrase is, the Lord was with Joseph, right? The divine presence the garment may have symbolized did not disappear when the garment disappeared, right? And that's really important. And for Latter-day Saints, it's going to resonate. Sacred garments are not magical objects. They are symbols of a covenant relationship. The clothing, the cloth, yeah, sure, it matters, but the covenant is what matters more. That's the thing that's important. So Joseph loses the garment, but he does not lose the covenant. He loses the visible sign, but he does not lose the divine reality to which the sign pointed. And then the story moves again, right? Joseph is later clothed by Pharaoh in fine linen with gold around his neck. New garments, new office, new visible robes. So the old garment is gone, but his calling still remains. God never abandoned Joseph's covenant path. He transformed the context in which we saw it unfold. And that is the pattern, right? Garments mark identity and calling, but the ultimate substance is deeper than the cloth. Joseph, his identity as God's covenant servant, he endured through every change of clothing. So what was Joseph's ketonet passim? At the most careful, scholarly level, it was probably a long sleeve, ornamented, or otherwise distinctive robe that marked Joseph as specially favored and set apart from his brothers. Probably not a rainbow-colored coat in the way that popular imagination suggests. More likely a garment of rank, status, and symbolic significance. And at the theological level, it appears to participate in a much larger biblical pattern. A pattern in which garments mark covenant relationship, priestly identity, and sacred inheritance. And for Latter-day Saints, that pattern, which we recognize it. It resonates deeply with temple theology and the sacred symbolism of covenant clothing. So, no, it was never just a coat. It's a statement about identity and calling, inheritance, and about covenant relationships. So when Jacob gave it to Joseph, he wasn't just saying, hey, I like you best, you're my favorite kid, right? He's declaring that Joseph stood in a distinctive relationship to the future of the family. And the brothers understood that. And here's the irony. In stripping Joseph of his garment and selling him into slavery, they actually helped place him where God needed him to be to save the very covenant line they thought that they were displacing. The symbol was attacked, but the calling still endured. And there's some really great lessons in that. For anyone who wears sacred garments as covenant symbols, whether in ancient priestly service or in modern temple worship, Joseph's story teaches us this. The garment, it's just a symbol. It's not the substance. The covenant must be written on the heart, not merely worn on the body. And God remains with his people, not because they possess a sacred object in a specific location, but because they remain faithful to the covenants that the object represented. So Joseph lost his ketonet passim, but he did not lose the covenant it symbolized. The Lord was with Joseph in the pit, in Potiphar's house, the prison, and the Pharaoh's court. With or without the garment, Joseph remained faithful. And maybe that's the deepest truth here, right? That the most important garment is the one we cannot see, the covenant written on the heart. The faithfulness that remains when external symbols are stripped away from us. And the identity as God's covenant people that no betrayal can finally destroy that ever. So the coat may not have been of many colors, but the covenant it represented was richer than any sort of, rainbow textile that could have existed. Anyway, that's all I got on that. So if this bonus deep dive has expanded your understanding of Joseph's story, make sure you're subscribed, hit the notification bell, right? Because our goal here is to bring biblical scholarship and theology together in a way that is meant to be serious, faithful, and deeply textured. And also, don't forget to check out the full written article that I have on my Substack. That version includes the Hebrew linguistic analysis, the full citation to Jewish sources and to other authorities. It has discussion questions and a bibliography. So if you want to go deeper into this, because trust me, there's so much more you can get into this, you'll have plenty of sources to go and dig through. Also, let me know in the comments, right? Did you grow up with the coat of many colors image? How does understanding ketonet passim differently, does it change the way you read the story of Joseph? And for our LDS viewers, do you see the connection here to the temple garment and the theology? And what questions does it raise for you, right? Also, what other questions and insights did you have? Like, what are you thinking about after kind of going through this? Please share them in the comments. I learn from everybody I'm interacting with all the time, and what you think may be obvious may be it may be revelatory to somebody else. It may be highly inspirational. So don't hold back. Let's keep engaging in conversation as a community on this. And of course, this week in the Come Follow Me, we're reading Genesis 37. So pay attention to that garment. Don't just kind of rush through it or just picture it as some silly, multicolored coat. It's just not a narrative decoration. It's part of what we're learning about covenant theology that's woven throughout the text. And if you do wear sacred garments as symbols of covenant, let Joseph's example remind you that the physical symbol can be stripped away, but the covenant represents, it endures as long as you remain faithful. And the next time someone shows you a children's Bible with Joseph in a rainbow-striped robe, you can smile and say, actually, the Hebrew is more interesting than that. And you can tell them that about covenant garments, priestly authority, and theology symbols that are sacred, that running from Eden to Exodus and even into the latter-day restoration. So the coat wasn't many colors, but the truth it carries is really more beautiful, right? So, yeah, I hope you all appreciated this. I hope you got something deep and meaningful out of it. And I look forward to seeing your comments. Until then, as always, I appreciate you and love you all. And thank you for spending some of your precious time to come listen with me.